It's international trade business. Basis for trade, what are we talking about? Well, there's this thing called comparative advantage. Does that ring a bell somewhere? Specialization. And then the demand and supply for exports and imports. So what is this comparative advantage business? Well, it's just one of those facts, really, unfortunately. Like, not all men are born equal, as they say. You know, and the same applies to countries. Not all countries have the same distribution of resources, or even if they have the same resources, the quality of those resources is not necessarily the same. So what tends to happen then is different places in the world are going to produce different things. Who should produce what, and the general sort of idea behind the basis of trade, behind comparative advantage, is the notion that we should let something be produced by those that can produce it the cheapest, which is kind of a general economic principle that we've dealt with since microeconomics as well. The idea of efficiency is all about minimizing costs and maximizing benefit. So if we can get something to be produced by those that can produce it the cheapest, then we are minimizing the cost of producing things. And so we are able to move towards our economic goal. What is our economic goal? Well, one of them potentially is to get as much as we can out of our limited resources. Okay? So the idea of comparative advantage, if you will recall, is different to the idea of absolute advantage. Remember, absolute advantage says who can produce the most of something. Comparative advantage says who can produce it the cheapest. So, what is specialization then? Specialization is all about efficiency. What do we mean by efficiency? Well, what we find is that we can produce the most of something, or we can produce the most of everything in general. We can get the most stuff that we want if we produce it at the lowest opportunity cost. If we're producing things at the lowest opportunity cost, it means we're giving up the least amount of what we have available in order to produce those things. And because we're giving up the least amount of things available, we have more of those things to make other stuff. Right? So if we can produce things cheaply, it means we can use some of the resources that we would have been using to produce those things if we'd been producing them in an expensive manner, and use those resources to produce other stuff. So if output is produced at the lowest opportunity cost, then what we're saying is produce it in the country that has a comparative advantage. It's basically the same thing. Producing it where it has the lowest opportunity cost is like saying the country with a comparative advantage should be producing. So, in other words, if we, let me just make it big again. If we just look at a set of diagrams from, this was actually from the McConnell textbook. I just haven't referenced it yet, as I said, it's still under construction, this whole section. We have two countries, Namibia and we have South Africa. Each of these countries can produce one of two goods. They can produce meat or they can produce wheat, just to make things difficult for you. So meat and wheat. So I think what is easier is to call this one M and this one W. Okay, so South Africa can produce M or it can produce W. Namibia can produce M and W. Given these two diagrams, who has the absolute advantage in the production of M? South Africa, you happy with that? How do we know it's South Africa? Because they can produce, if they are producing no W, they will then produce 30 tons of meat. And what is absolute advantage? Absolute advantage is who can produce the most. Namibia, if it produces 0 tons of wheat, is only producing 20 tons of M. So 20M versus 30M, who can produce the most? South Africa has the absolute advantage in producing M. Who has the absolute advantage in producing W? South Africa? Easy? Okay. So South Africa can produce the most W. South Africa can produce 30W, Namibia can produce 20W. So these are production possibilities frontiers, right? They're showing us the combination of goods that those countries can produce. Our production possibilities frontier, or our PPF that we see there, doesn't quite look like the PPFs that we usually see. What is the difference? Anything obvious? Anything easily noticeable about the difference between these PPFs and the ones that we normally look at? So, these ones are straight lines. Normally the PPFs that we look at are bowed outwards, away from the origin, right? Concave to the origin. These ones are straight. If these are straight lines, what does that tell us about opportunity costs? Constant opportunity costs. Which means that these PPFs are a little bit more basic than what we would normally be dealing with. But the concept applies equally well to a PPF that shows increasing opportunity costs. In other words, a PPF that is bowed outwards. It just gets a little bit more difficult. Having said that it's a little bit more difficult does not mean that we wouldn't potentially ask you a question where we have a PPF that goes outwards. So, if that's what you see, don't be intimidated by it. You can still work it out using the same principles. Well, when I say work it out, what I'm going to talk about now is who should be producing what and according to what principles. So, South Africa can produce meat and it can produce M and it can produce W. Namibia can produce M and it can produce W. What is the cost to producing M in South Africa? The cost of producing M is any W that you have to give up. That's the opportunity cost, right? And the same applies in Namibia. Any M that it produces, the opportunity cost is giving up some W. Okay? And the same applies to producing W. If you produce W, whether you're in Namibia or in South Africa, you're giving up M with your resources. So the opportunity cost of producing W is M. But if we've got different slopes to our curves, what that means is that we have different opportunity costs. We have constant opportunity costs because the lines are straight, but they are still nevertheless, with different slopes, different opportunity costs. So what is the opportunity cost of each one? Well, we can work it out here. Sorry, this table doesn't... Yeah, so I've got it written down there. I thought it was in the table as well. Forgot. Right, so if South Africa, let's make it a bit darker. In South Africa, are we happy that with a slope with an intercept on the y-axis of 30 and an intercept on the x-axis of 30, the slope of that line is 1. Right? Change in y, but change in x, are you happy that it's 1? What that means is that 1 W in South Africa costs 1 M. Does that make sense to you? If we want to, in other words, if we're going to calculate a derivative, if we want to calculate that slope of that diagram, let's take a look at it again. We're saying change in y over change in x equals 1. You happy with that? In other words, change in M over change in W equals 1. Right? In other words, if we want to change M by 1, by how much must we change W? By 1. Because the change in M divided by the change in W must equal 1. So if the change in M is 1, what must the change in W be? 1 to get 1. Okay? And it's a negative slope, which means that if we increase M by 1, we must decrease W by 1 as well. So 1 W costs 1 M. What about Namibia? Well, we've got an intercept of 20 and an intercept of 10. What is the slope of that line? Change in Y over change in X? 2. You happy with that? Okay, in other words, change in M over change in W is equal to 2 over 1, right? So if I want to change M by 1, by how much must I change W? 1 divided by what? You happy with that? What did you say? Did you say 2? A half, right? 1 divided by a half must equal 2. You happy with that? Change in M, 1, divided by change in W, a half, equals 2. So if I want M to go up by 1, how much must W change by? A half. You happy with that? I'm not getting much vibe here, so I don't know if that means you're not sure. Okay, in other words, 1W costs 2M, or another way of writing that is 1M costs half a W. You happy with that? Am I moving too slowly? Is this too obvious? Okay. So 1M costs 1W in South Africa, 1M costs half a W in Namibia. Where is M cheapest? M is cheapest in Namibia. Where is W cheapest? Well, 1W costs 1M in South Africa, 1W costs 2M in Namibia, so where's W cheapest? In South Africa, right? So who should produce W and who should produce M? In terms of the comparative advantage, South Africa should produce W. I mean, I don't know, am I talking to myself here? I'm not really. Are you completely confused? You don't know what's going on? Or is it so obvious that you're entirely bored? So who should produce W? Okay, who should produce M? Okay. So then what are the terms of trade? Terms of trade, if it costs South Africa 1M to make 1W, and South Africa is going to produce M, okay? Then when South Africa trades M, what price should it receive for the M that it gives away? If it costs 1W to make 1M, what sort of price will it want to receive in terms of W? South Africa produces wheat, okay? So if it costs South Africa 1M to produce 1W, 1 wheat, it's going to trade away wheat. What price should it get for its wheat in terms of, it's W in terms of M? It would want 1M for its 1W. What would it want? Less than 1M? It would want more than 1M, right? In Namibia, it costs 2M to make 1W. Okay? So if it's going to be buying W, what does it want to pay for W? Does it want to pay 2M? Does it want to pay more than 2M? Is it prepared to pay more than 2M? No. Why? Because if it's producing W and if it were to produce W and it were to cost 2M, why would it buy W for more than 2M? It's cheaper to then just produce W internally. Yeah? So if it was going to buy W, what price would it pay? Less than 2M. Okay? Which means we've now set up terms of trade. South Africa produces W and it costs 1M, and it will want to sell it for more than 1M. Namibia is going to be buying W. If it buys W, well, if it produces W, it costs 2M, which means if it buys W, it wants to pay less than 2M. So we have a price that we're going to settle at that would be advantageous to both. What would that price range be? Greater than 1M, less than 2M. Yeah? So if we can trade W for a price between 1M and 2M, then both countries benefit. You happy with that idea? Okay. So the terms of trade must be 1W less than 1M, greater than 1M less than 2M. Both countries would be happy with, say, 1.5M. You happy with that? 1.5 M to every 1 wheat. What we see is, what would the inverse of that be? The inverse of that would be, if we're trading 1.5 M for 1 W, what is the price of 1 M? 1 M is then 0.66 W. You happy with that idea? Does that work the other way around when we think about, because we were trading wheat, right? And we were talking about how the price of the wheat was advantageous to both. In terms of meat, what about the guys that are selling the meat? Are they getting a good price or not? Or the guys buying the meat, are they getting a good price? Well, if we do basically the reverse of that transaction, we know Namibia is producing M, meat, right? And we know that 1 M costs half a W in Namibia and 1 M costs 1 W in South Africa, right? So if South Africa is going to buy M, how much is it going to pay for M? Less than 1 W, right? Namibia is producing M. How much does it want to sell it for? More than a half W. And what price did we settle at when we looked at the price that was advantageous to both in terms of W? 1.5 M, which is the same as 0.66 W per M. Does that also sit in the right range? Greater than a half, less than 1. So it doesn't matter which way we work it out, it's going to be advantageous, because whether we work it out from the side of the meat or the M, or whether we work it out from the side of the W, it's just doing the same thing. Just the one is the inverse of the other. So if we calculate it for the one, it'll work for the other one as well. So the one is just the inverse of the other. So what then would the gains from trade be in this instance? If South Africa produces and sells W, and it costs South Africa 1 M to make 1 W, it sells 1 W for 1.5 M, therefore South Africa gains 0.5 M for every 1 W that it sells. You happy with that? So South Africa could therefore, if it only produced W, and we know that it could produce 30 W, it can sell 30 W for 45 M according to that price. In other words, 30 W times 1.5 M for each W gives you 45 M. And so in that case, South Africa would have more M than it could produce for itself through trade. It can only itself produce 30 M. But if it produced 30 W and sold it for 1.5 M per W, it would have 45 M. And 45 M is greater than the 30 M it can produce for itself. You happy with that idea? Same applies to Namibia. Namibia produces and sells M's. It costs Namibia 0.5 W to make an M. It sells 1 M for 0.66 W, which means it gains 0.16 W for every 1 M sold. Namibia could sell the 20 M that it produces for 13.3 W. Namibia would therefore have more W than it could produce by itself. It can only produce 10 W, but after trade, it would be able to consume 13.3 W. In other words, it could have more of the good than it could produce by itself. Okay? Those are the gains from trade. How do we represent that diagrammatically? South Africa is producing W, wheat, right? And it sold all its wheat for M. It could either have 30 W and 0 M, or if it sold all of its W for meat, it would have 0 W and 45 M after trade. So the PVF has shifted outwards, and we have two new intercept values. Well, one of them is the same as it was before, which is the good that it's producing. The other one is much higher because it's gained from trade. Now, of course, it doesn't have to produce 30 W and sell all its W. It can produce 30 W and sell a portion of that W, right? And after selling a portion of that W, it could buy some meat. What we see in this diagram is we've moved, initially we were at some points, South Africa was producing some quantity of M and W. Then it decided to trade with Namibia. It stopped producing this quantity of M and W and started only producing W. It produced W, it then sold 10W. Having sold 10W, how many M's would it buy for 10W? At a price of 1.5 M per W. It would have how much M? 15. So it produces 30W. It sells 10W. How much W has it got left? 20. How much M did it buy for those 10W? 15. So how much M has it got? 15. We've got a combination of 15M, 15M and 20W. We are at that point A dash, right? A dash is outside of our original production possibilities frontier. In other words, we are now consuming a quantity of goods that is more than what we could produce by ourselves. Yes?
Is the benefits from trade section in the book? Because it isn't in the reading. So
it's in chapter 3.
So it is in chapter, okay.
Yeah. So this whole section is chapter 3 of Mankey. Yeah. The other section, the next, whatever, lower down part of the mind map, is all that reading, which would be chapter 13 of Mankey as well. And you're welcome to read chapter 13 of Mankey. We're just not making it a compulsory reading. Okay, so you're happy that this combination of goods, 15 meat and 20 wheat, 15M, 20W, is not something that they could produce themselves. Right? The same with Namibia. What Namibia does is initially it was, say, at some point B, it decides to engage in trade in South Africa. What it does is it specializes in the good that it has a comparative advantage in, which means it produces only M. Produces 20M. It sells 15M to South Africa. By selling 15M, how much W can it buy? Well, the price was 1.5M for every W. So if it's selling 15M, how much W is it getting? 10. So it produced 20M. It sold 15, which means it's left with 5. For those 15M that it sold, it bought 10W. So now there's a combination of 10W, 5M, and it's at this point here, B dash, right? B dash is outside of its original production possibilities frontier. It's on the new production possibilities frontier that we have there, which is the PPF after, well, it's more like, it's not a production possibilities frontier, it's more like a consumption possibilities frontier after trade. It's like a PPF after trade. Yeah? Are you happy with that idea? And what do you think? This is all straightforward, very easy, boring. You know how to do it. You've done it 10 times over. Any issues? You remain silent, however. Yeah, I've seen how people answer these questions. So. Hopefully you do know what's going on. Okay, so then that brings us to, if this is trade, we're talking about trade. In our example, we had South Africa and Namibia trading meat and wheat. If South Africa is selling wheat and buying meat, selling W, buying M, that means that it would be exporting W and importing M. You happy with that idea? Okay, so now we can link this to our ADAS diagram. So we're talking now about the demand and supply for exports and imports. So here's just a section that comes from some previous textbook. You don't have to worry about it too much, but it's got some nice diagrams that Mankey doesn't have. He talks about the same stuff, but you don't have to worry about the diagrams. It just helps to explain it. In other words, what I'm saying is the principles apply. You don't have to worry about the diagrams. The diagrams just help explain the principles. So what would then tend to happen if we were a country producing is that if the world price is higher than what the price is domestically, then we will tend to export stuff, right? And if the world price is lower than the domestic price, then we will tend to import stuff. That is just another way of saying that the country that can produce things at the lowest cost has the comparative advantage and should produce that thing. That's basically what those two sentences are saying, the same thing, right? If the world price is higher than the domestic price, in other words, the cost of something is more in the rest of the world than what it is for us to produce it locally, what we will tend to do is produce more of it and export. And the rest of the world will produce less and import from us. So, same as in South Africa and Namibia, the cost of wheat in South Africa was lower than the cost of wheat in Namibia. So what happened? South Africa produced wheat and exported wheat. The world prices, there's only two countries, so the world price in this instance would be South Africa looking at the price in Namibia, or Namibia looking at the price in South Africa. And then the converse, if the world price is lower, then we import. So this series of diagrams, like I say, just kind of helps make that even better, makes that explanation even better, is just showing demand and supply for some particular good in South Africa. Here we're talking about maize. Here's the price of maize in South Africa. If the world price was 1.25, what would South Africa tend to do? They would increase production of maize and start selling maize on the world market. What would that mean in South Africa? Well, the price of maize in South Africa would also rise. And what we'd actually end up with, strangely, is this surplus production, right? In other words, we would produce 50 more than what we were consuming, and that surplus production would then be sold in the rest of the market, in the rest of the world, right? Alternatively, if South Africa was producing maize at a cost of 1, and the world price we could buy maize at a cost of 0.75, what would happen is we would cut back our production until the cost of maize, of producing maize in South Africa was also 0.75, right? We could then, when we got our 0.75, what we would find is at that cost, the demand for maize in South Africa would be much greater than it was previously. And the quantity demanded is much greater than the quantity supplied. There's a shortage of maize in South Africa. And how do we fill that shortage? We import maize at that world price. You happy with that idea? Because we've got an upward sloping supply curve, we're dealing with increasing marginal cost, which means we're dealing with increasing opportunity cost, which means that if we were to look at this in terms of a PPF, we wouldn't have straight line PPF. In this example, the rest of the world is Canada. So it's South Africa looking at Canada. South Africa is making maize. Canada is making maize. Canada can make maize at a price of 0.75. South Africa can make it at the price of 1, right? In the Canadian market, there would be no maize exported or imported at that price of 0.75. If the entire world market consisted only of Canada and South Africa, would the trade between the two happen at a price of 0.75? Kind of like the same questions we answered before. Would they trade at a price of 0.75? No. Why? Because it costs Canada 0.75. There's no gains to trade from them. And we can see in their demand-supply diagram that in fact there would be no maize for them to export anyway, because internally all that maize would be eaten. Yeah?
Do they factor in cost to actually get it there? Like,
Yeah, we assume that that's zero. You can factor it in and it doesn't change anything about it, except that then there is a margin that separates any particular price in one place and another place. And the trade must be able to, the gains from trade must be greater than that margin for trade to happen. If it's not greater than that margin, then trade wouldn't happen. In other words, if it costs me R1 to do something here, and I can buy it from the US for 80 cents. It costs 80 cents in the US, right? South African cents. Then I would want to import it from the US. You happy with that? If, however, the transport costs are 30 cents, once it gets to South Africa, the price would be R1.10, and then there's no point in importing it from the US. So if that transport cost is greater than that 20% differential, there won't be any trade, right? If, however, it costs 80 cents in the US and the transport cost is only 10 cents, it's still cheaper for me to import it from the US. So I will still import from the US. I'll pay 90 cents instead of 80 cents. Okay. So what would the terms of trade be between South Africa and Canada if they were the only two countries? Well, the price must be below R1 but above 0.75. You happy with that idea? There would be some price in between where the shortage in South Africa would equal the surplus in Canada. And at that price, trade makes everyone happy. Okay. And that is just what those diagrams were showing. As I said, those diagrams are not in your textbook. You don't have to worry about them. They just help me in any way, put everything together. Okay, so there's time for a break.